levantan todos los días con el sol.
My talk is about how the AFL-CIO has aided and abetted the Histadrut, and thus aided and abetted. The Histadrut is the main labor union in Israel, and how it thus supported the Israeli state in the process of supporting the Histadrut, which has a major role to play not only now, but in creating the Israeli state in the first place. And let me just say that I think it's profoundly unfortunate and deliberate on the part of the AFL-CIO leaders to keep American workers sort of ignorant about what's going on in the world, because more than ever, we need working class solidarity, or, our world is really basically at stake. Okay, so the AFL has, as I said, has afforded tremendous protection to the Histadrut, which is the Israeli, from any sort of criticism, which is the main labor union in Israel. The Histadrut is the handmaiden of the Israeli state, and the Israeli state is the junior partner to American imperialism. The Histadrut has billed itself as a labor union and thus the defender of the Israeli working class. But if one examines it honestly, it is clear that without the Histadrut, Israeli capitalism would have had a hard time getting off the ground. The early founders of the Israeli state concur that without the Histadrut, there would likely be no Israeli state. It does not have any semblance of independence because it is part of the state apparatus. In addition to the fact that the Histadrut is in no way a labor union, the AFL-CIO pretends that it is. In the article, Histadrut, Israel's Racist Trade Unions, an article upon which I will draw throughout the talk, the author points out that Golda Meir explains in 1928, I was put on the Histadrut executive committee at a time when this big labor union wasn't just a trade union organization, it was a great colonizing agency. So right from the jump, the purpose of the Histadrut was to get this Israeli project off the ground and to really make sure that this colonizing project, undermining any sort of Palestinian control, would be what would be in power. Ben-Gurion goes on to argue that without Histadrut, I doubt whether we would have had a state. The trade unions, by their nature, are pro-capitalist. And this is the problem with the AFL. This is the problem with all trade unions. They're pro-capitalist. They do not want to overthrow capitalism. They therefore will never challenge capitalism, which is it's a bridge that the bosses need and the workers in order to pull in the workers so that they have the unions in order to essentially let the workers know that they have some sort of rights within the capitalist society, but really not too many. And that's what's happening at the AFL convention right now. So the Histadrut, but from the very beginning, had never had any semblance of independence because it was part of the Israeli project in order to build capitalism in areas that were already, controlled by the Palestinians and have historically been controlled by the Palestinians. It is virtually impossible to call this a trade union. And just in comparison to what was going on in the 1930s, and I've sort of mentioned this before in one of our last discussions, Mussolini and Hitler had organized a corporate estate. And involved in this corporate estate were the trade unions. They sat on the board of directors of these fascist countries and helped to make sure that the working class did not challenge, fascism at all. And ultimately, the Histadrut serves the same role. It helps to build capitalism and to make sure that the Israeli working class, and especially the Palestinian working class, doesn't get out of control. The unions were not independent. As I said, they sat on the boards. This is no less true of the Histadrut, which helped organize capitalism and helped to drive the indigenous peoples, which is the Palestinians, basically off their land. In a series of strikes that either were mixed, that just as a proof that the Palestinian strikes that were mixed, that of both Palestinians and Jews, and also of Arab workers alone, the Histadrut sent in strikebreakers to break these strikes where there was unity between Arabs and Jews, or just when the Arabs went out on strike on their own. So if we examine the two most influential persons in the Israeli project, it is clear in an unabashed explanation that the Histadrut is an arm of the Israeli state, not only an organizer of industry, but is part of the settler colonial project. And unlike the sellout politics and class collaborationist politics of the AFL, which everybody has spoken to so far, the purpose of the Histadrut was to get this project underway. It was the owner of 25% of the capitalist industries, employing labor, and often employed strikebreakers so that any independent activity of the working class would be shut down. It sounds a little bit the way that David Hepson just described the ANC. And so any well-respected capitalist nation wishes and needs to expand its economic and political influence in the rest of the world. But for the moment, the Israelis decided that the Middle East was its back door. Imperialism thus became the driving force of the Israeli economy. The author argues that in 1958, the International Institute for Development, Cooperation, and Labor Studies was established as a means of furthering Western interests in the Third World. Half of its graduates came from the Asian Institute for Labor Studies and Cooperation, funded by the CIA through the AFL-CIO. It operated on behalf of the US in Africa and African countries such as Zaire and Kenya. It thus operated as an arm of the Israeli and US foreign policy. Moreover, Israel was committed to support the apartheid regime in South Africa. Not seeing this as a morally repugnant nation, Israel armed the white South African regime, modeling its own policies on the suppression of the Palestinian people. For example, Iskor Steel Company, which has 51%, its own 51%, its ownership is by the Histadrut. Core's industry at 49% was owned by the South African regime, by the Steel Corporation, which manufactured steel for South Africa's armed forces. Partly finished steel was shipped from Israel to South Africa, enabling the apartheid state to escape tariffs. It's really sort of mind-boggling how low the Israeli state had become in terms of wanting to build its own project. And since it really didn't concern itself with its own racist policies against the Palestinians, it really didn't care or think much about the racist policies of the South African whites against the Black masses. Other Histadrut companies such as Tad Duran and Soltam were equally complicit in supplying South Africa with weaponry. It also helped build the electronic wall between South Africa, Namibia, and the neighboring African states. In the early 1960s, the Histadrut was a conduit for CIA and Mossad in Africa, and later cooperated with the AFL-CIO A-Field program and the CIA to undermine rural cooperatives in El Salvador. It is recognized by the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions as a representative of all Israeli workers, even though its very nature is to discriminate against Arab workers. For instance, Arab workers must pay a fee to the Histadrut, but is not at all represented by the Histadrut at all. Class struggle was an anathema to the Histadrut. In 1951, seamen who were on strike were drafted into the army with Histadrut's support. This goes back as far as the 1920s, when Wudan Dad workers went on strike and were starved into submission by Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion, remember, not only is the first president, but was part of the Histadrut. The organization's utter class collaborationism has not only undermined the Arab worker, but it has undermined the Jewish workers as well, with the inevitable outcome that we are witnessing now. That is, with the utter racism that is displayed on the part of the Jewish working class. This is how a capitalist arrives at implanting a colonial settler state. The Jewish working class at the beginning of this project believed that it was setting up a socialist society. The Jewish capitalists thought differently and used this desire for liberation as a battering ram against Palestinians, who are the indigenous people. All the evidence points to the criminality of people such as Ben Gurion, who explicitly said that class struggle meant struggle against Arab labor. Ben Gurion argued that the role of the working class was a national one, to construct the Jewish state. Socialism was never an aim in itself, but a tool for the advancement of national objectives. It was Ben Gurion who coined the slogan "From Class to Nation." Both perspectives saw the role of labor as a nationalist role. This perspective was one that was very much supported by fascist governments such as Mussolini's Italy. The Histadrut founded Haganah, the Zionist terrorist group, in the 1920s, and Mapai, which became the Israeli Labor Party in the 1930s. Ben Gurion was Histadrut's first Secretary General, who became in 1935 chairman of the Jewish Agency, the Zionist government in waiting, and in 1948, the Minister of State of Israel. Ben Gurion made it clear that there was no reason to respect Palestinian rights, and that it was also clear that Palestinians, understandably, would not give up their land without a fight. Ben Gurion stated that we do not recognize the right of Palestinian Arabs to rule the country, since Palestine is still underdeveloped and awaits its builders. I mean, the profound racism of this statement, that we need to have these white people coming from Europe to build the economy and civilize the Palestinian people, is really smacks of all of the racist attitudes that Europeans had when they went to Africa and Latin America. We are waiting, since the Palestinians have no rights, since they're inferior people and are incapable of building their own country. Not to mention that they've lived there for thousands of years and had a very thriving culture. The list of Israeli crimes have been documented in thousands of books on the subject, but it is the pretend nature of its support for workers, that it is a labor union of some sort that allows the AFL-CIO to pretend as well. The list of crimes is more extensive than what I am focusing on in this talk, but I want to focus on the relationship between the AFL-CIO and the Histadrut and the Israeli state, because covering for the Histadrut means covering for the Israeli state. So why is the AFL coming down on the side of the oppressor? The history of the AFL has been one of racism and sexism and elitism from the very jump. It historically works with management, protecting white male workers, and thus they can more effectively win contracts for the aristocracy of labor. But in the process, it must sell everyone else out. Therefore, they are no stranger to organizations such as the Histadrut, and will thus lend a hand to the bosses. By the way, if anyone is interested, we had a first sort of get together in Washington, and all the different talks are on our website, so you can watch them in a more thorough way. So shamefully, in a recent situation where a Palestinian American reporter, Shireen Abu Akleh, this is just recent, was shot and killed by the Israeli troops. A sniper shot her, knew that she was there, knew that she was a reporter. The Israeli troops not only shot her, but attacked the funeral after she was killed. And Liz Schuler, who is the president of the AFL after Trumka died, and Randy Weingarten, both went to Israel to discuss with the Labor Party Zionist chair, Merev Mikeli, saying absolutely nothing about the murder of this Palestinian American journalist. And while the San Francisco Labor Council tried to entertain a resolution over BDS, the National AFL-CIO Western Regional Director, Fernando Losada, said, expressions of solidarity are always good, but in terms of setting international policy, that is the purview of the National AFL-CIO through our organizational process, meaning that anything that has to do with BDS or support of the Palestinians in any way is absolutely off the table. There's an existing policy in solidarity with working people in the Holy Land. This is what he says. It does not include BDS. According to The Intercept, AFL-CIO leadership cited a procedural rule to tell the San Francisco Labor Council it couldn't even debate a resolution on BDS. In my opinion, and probably the opinion of others in the pile, the AFL-CIO is complicit in the murder of Shireen and so many others, since Schuler and Weingarten met with the leader of the Israeli Labor Party, and Schuler, moreover, sent a letter to the San Francisco Labor Council saying that delegates could not discuss the boycott of Israel. And just as an aside, Randy Weingarten absolutely supports charter schools, which undermines public education. Okay, so let us not forget that the Interior Minister of Israel is a member of the Labor Party who supported the murder of the journalist, and the Labor Party supports the apartheid state, and Liz Schuler supports the state of Israel. The AFL is absolutely thoroughly complicit in the murder of this journalist, and right after that, there was another journalist that was killed like a week or two later. Thus, instead of being in solidarity with the Palestinians, US labor has taken the side of the oppressor. Every time members of any union have attempted to defend the rights of Palestinians, the AFL-CIO has stepped in to defend the Israeli state and has either sidelined Palestinian rights or has forcefully defended the actions of the Israelis and have prevented any dissent among its union members. For instance, in a manual written by the Jewish Labor Committee for pro-Israel lobby, a pro-Israel lobby group in 2008, which Randy Weingarten, somebody kept asking about Randy Weingarten, is a member of this group. This manual says, please do not discuss with union members, representatives of the press or others, guesstimates of the value of the State of Israel bonds held by unions. Divest from Israel activists have used such information in their arguments and have quoted figures found in Jewish newspapers and or provided by Jewish communal representatives. I just want to say that in the last union that I was in, I'm in the AFT now, but I was in DC 37 before, and it's now wiped clean from the web, that the DC 37 not only invested in Israeli bonds, but the bonds, the money went into Jewish schools that taught hatred for Palestinians. It's now no longer, I tried to find the reference again. It's now not there. But I know that it was there because when I was a delegate in DC 37, I raised it. And as soon as I said anything, it was like the gavel came down and I was being a racist. I was an anti-Semite because I was upset about the fact that our money, working class money, is being used to, gear up and generate hate for Palestinians. U.S. labor movement has continued to invest since the 1950s. Okay. In Israeli bonds, unions and their pension funds have been buying up State of Israel bonds. The American labor unions collectively hold millions in Israeli bonds. The AFT alone reported to the Department of Labor that the union has invested $200,000 in State of Israel bonds. Richard Trumka, the former head of the AFL, absolutely opposed support for BDS. More recently, members of the Connecticut AFL-CIO successfully got the State Labor Federation to dump $25,000 in Israeli bonds in 2010. But 5 years later, the Connecticut Federation passed a resolution calling on the National AFL to support BDS. The vote was nullified by Trumka. But give me 5 minutes. But just recently, major unions and labor federations in Oregon passed unprecedented resolutions calling for divestment from an Israeli company over its human rights abuses. In March, both the American Federation of Labor and Congress Industrial Organization and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, collectively representing 300,000 workers in the state, passed a resolution calling for the state of Oregon to divest. And finally, in my union, the Professional Staff Congress, the International Committee, a committee of which I am a member, along with the Academic Freedom Committee and the Anti-Racism Committee, passed a resolution on Palestine, which passed almost overwhelmingly at the Delegate Assembly. And while that was great news, almost immediately the Zionists in the union went on the attack one of the resolves was that we were supposed to be discussing BDS and bring it to the AFT convention. This is not happening. The Zionists, as we can see, hold tremendous weight in the unions. It is clear that the working class is far ahead of our leaders, and with a different leadership, we can make headway fighting for the democratic rights of oppressed people. But I would also like to add that if we don't break through, not only on this issue, but similar ones such as women's right to choose, Black rights, etc., we will be moving closer and closer to a fascist society. Victory, in my opinion, can only be won with a conscious, organized working class that is willing to build a movement that will knock down the barriers that capitalism has set up to divide us. And that means we must start by dumping our leaders, since they are the main obstacle standing in the way of this effort.